So it's definitely not a coincidence that it's MIT and Harvard who have the opposing theories here, right?
Yes, they have.
But it's interesting that indeed we saw when we did the poll in the class, it's like it was most of the people said, yeah, it's a combination of both, right? So on one hand, change can only happen if you kind of create that emergency. But on the would be personally more the Sengi ideal, right? So because with Collibra, I mean, if you look back at where we come from as a company, the collective aspect, the community aspect was always very important in this technology we shaped. So we always actually were more like, okay, how can you create the right feedback loops? You also spoke about these positive feedback loops. We would call that, we would also implement it in our operating model in the software. You would have workflows to kind of drive the change and drive the feedback. And indeed start small and then slowly grow your community, and people kind of get used to their new roles and stewardship. So it's also not a coincidence. The name Collibra, of course, is a combination of collective and collaborative, finding balance and freedom, which is actually very much summarizes the system dynamics of complex systems in a way.
And of course his take on that is that you get more powerful change that way. When people are really motivated and they build their own community or coalition, that the growth accelerates and becomes more than just a linear growth. The other thing we discussed, of course, you mentioned earlier, is all of these changes are good, but they need to be measurable. And so it's really difficult to manage without measurement. And I find in the work that I do that many people are a little confused about the different types of measurements. And we discussed 3 types in the workshop, all of which are quite important, I think. So these programs, data governance, information quality, the analytics programs that are usually always put in phases or stages. So one important metric is what I call progress metrics, and that's how far along are we in the implementation of the program. How many of the critical data elements have been put into the glossary, or how many thresholds have been established for data quality. So those are very important. The other 2, though, are also quite important. One is verification metrics. So whenever you have any kind of requirement, for example, a data quality requirement or a policy in the data governance, then if there's a requirement, you need to measure if that requirement is being met. And so those are verification metrics. So if you have a requirement that all new sources that come in have to be immediately cataloged and profiled and go through a data quality process, then that needs to be tracked to see that there's been compliance with that particular requirement. The one that's the hardest to get to, but perhaps the most important of all, is the value metrics. And we generally call those validation in the more formal way. So validations mean that you're validating the value of your program. And so whatever value proposition that you put forth to create the program. So if data governance was sort of sold on the idea of the organization, for example, that it would reduce the compliance penalties, then that is a measurement of the value, and that would be a validation. You can validate that if it's working, that those fines for non-compliance are going down, the total amount. So that sort of closes the loop from the progress in implementing the program, that the parts of the program are working properly, those are the verification metrics, and then finally that the overall program is producing value for the organization, and those are the validation metrics.
That's very interesting that you see that kind of a taxonomy, different metrics, and it's indeed very important to not mix them up, right? Otherwise it falls.
Well, it's certainly easy just to fall into the easy ones to measure, for example, the progress metrics, but you really need a good portfolio of all 3 of those metrics. Now, I will say that the validation metrics tend to be at a higher level. They're sort of aggregated in a way,
Yep.
in the sense that they roll up. And so typically validation metrics may only be a handful, 1 to 5, that are really tracking the value, whereas you may have many verification and a number of progress metrics.
Yep.